Loose ends. I've learned to calm myself by clenching my fists. What? I've learned to calm myself by clenching my fists, Stanley White said with a strange smile. And that makes me better than you. Eric stood still for a moment and then took a step back toward the wall. He gave a sideways glance at Freddy, whose Adam's apple bobbed in the flesh of his neck with each dry swallow. How does that make you better than me? Eric asked with an arched back. He tried to keep his repose around Mr. White, but he could feel his shoulders loosening and the muscles in his stomach growing tighter. We're a lot alike, Eric. When we both grow angry, we clench our fists. But how we use them differs, White explained, keeping his gaze with Eric strong. When you curl your fingers, you're only channeling your anger. You perspire, flex your muscles, stand upright, and grind your teeth. This is human nature, so I won't blame you. I am better than you because I can make a fist and regulate my heartbeat. I can remain calm and even smile. He broke off to show his yellow teeth. I can remain a cool customer even in the toughest situations. Unlike you, Eric, you can only veer off into a blind rage and lumber at your enemy like an ugly gorilla. The cords began to pop out in the hollow of Eric's neck, pumping and pulsating with violent adrenaline. There he was with his arms parallel at each of his sides, and at the ends were pale rocks. So what do? Eric spat. White only grinned. My hands are not weapons. A weapon can clean out a person's skull, he concluded, folding his arms. There was a long silence. Freddy and Eric stood in profile in front of their boss, as if they were in a straight police lineup, waiting for the verdict on who was guilty and who was not. White was placed between them, eyes running them up and down, measuring each inch. You guys are ganging up on me. White's smile was gone, and what replaced it was something like that of a dog's mouth. Eric could put his hand out to that dog's snout, but he wouldn't know if he could keep all his fingers. Me and Eric got to talking. There's too much at stake here. We feel like there's some loose ends we can't ignore, Freddy said. Well then, Freddy, let's get all this out in the air, shall we? White threw his arms above his head as if he was holding an enormous weight above him. His suede jacket rose above the cleft of his belly button, revealing the butt of his pistol tucked into the waistband of his jeans. Let's knot up all these loose ends. We appreciate that, Freddy replied without the faintest waver in his voice. He could keep eye contact with Stanley White and not even flinch. He'd known White for 30 years, and all the time he'd never once backed down from White or avoided his eyes once. Inside the abandoned warehouse on the corner of Federal and Palm Street, White took a step away from his partners and turned into the dull glow of his battery-operated camping lantern. He placed his hands into his pockets and spat into the sawdust scattered across the dusty, splintered remains of the floor. He lifted his head to gaze upward at the gaping skull of the building and inhaled deeply from the musty, dusty air. He let it out, that same strange smile creeping at each corner of his mouth. He suddenly looked different. There were more shadows draped across his features and an intoxicated swagger to his steps. He kept that tooth-filled grin. I don't understand, White practically whispered. I thought I explained all this. If I didn't, I apologize. Let me clear everything up for you. My uncle's grave was filled a week ago this Friday. Everyone has already forgotten about that dusty old fart. If we visited his grave tonight, what would we see, Freddy? A grave, he shot back at once. Well, yes, but what makes his grave different from all the rest, Eric? Eric considered for a moment and then said, Fresh dirt. Bingo. What we'd see is a pile of fucking dirt. We're not going to give my uncle time to sprout grass and weeds over it. That's our dirt, boys. If we were to dig him up and pour the soil back over the box, it'd look exactly as it did before we started digging. It'd be a pile of dirt. White crossed his arms again, raising his eyebrows, to further press the point hanging in the musty, dusty air. This is about covering our tracks, that's all, Freddy replied. A pile of dirt, Freddy. That's all it has to be. That's not the problem. Then what is? Are you afraid of pawning the pieces? White asked. The collector down in Longshore wants the pieces just as much as I do. No, Freddy began, chewing on his words. We don't. Well, the problem is... We don't want to kill the guard, all right? It's not necessary, Eric snapped. So here lies the problem. White sighed, scratching his head. Murder. Your consciousness can't deal with that ugly, ugly word. Is that right? Both men nodded in unison. Let me put it this way, boys. When we hit the cemetery on Monday night, the only thing standing between us and our treasure is the watchman. The only way to make sure he doesn't talk is if we bury him along with my uncle. I don't see why we can't knock him out and tie him up, Freddy said. Okay, apparently you haven't been listening to me. There was that temper again, flaring up like the flame on a new candle. If we tied the guy up, the next morning he'd tell the cops a group of men with shovels roughed him up and entered the graveyard. Then we'd have pigs snooping around the place, and they'd find footprints, shit like that. Somehow all signs would point to my uncle, and then I'd have police knocking on my door. Anyone with real cause to take the family treasure would be someone from his own family, White finished, hooking his thumbs toward his chest. But if we made sure to cover all our tracks, the police shouldn't come looking for you, Eric said, and Freddie nodded in agreement. You don't get it, he closed his eyes and clenched his fists. The sheer idea is that men with shovels enter a boneyard. What does that mean? Grave robbers. Police will eat that up. The cemetery knows a man was just buried with a variety of expensive trinkets, and all they need is the man's gravestone to record his name. Then they'll go from there. You're going about this the wrong way. We should sneak into the cemetery without even worrying about the guard. I bet he sleeps the whole night anyway, Freddie argued. And be looking over our shoulders all night? White cried. It's just an idea. That's what we're doing here. We're coming up with, alternatives, Freddie said. Do you realize how much thought I put into this plan? My uncle was buried a month ago this Friday, and we're set to dig next Monday. Even before I called you, I had this all charted point for point, and I'm not going to change it just because you boys are having a panic attack. Do you know how long I've been waiting to get my hands on these heirlooms? Yes, Freddie replied, your entire life. Ever since I've known you, your great-grandfather's pocket watch was all you ever talked about, and his war medals. They were supposed to be mine. As the last descendant of the White family line, I deserve them. My uncle was a selfish man, and even now as he begins to stink, he is a selfish man. Even though White fell silent, his haunting voice rang in the dilapidated building, bouncing above their heads. What's more selfish than selling your family heirlooms to some pawn shop? Eric said. Fuck you, White spat. From now on, Freddie speaks for you. We're the ones talking, and you're just here to look pretty. Hey, I'm just trying to help you. You needed an extra man to dig a grave, and here I am. I don't give a shit what you think. This is my plan here, and it's perfect just as it is. I was the one that did the research here. I was the one that met with the collector and had my family treasure valued. If you want that 800 grand split 3 ways, you'll do things my way. Bullshit, Eric cried. You need us and you know it. It'll take all night if you dig that grave alone. By sunrise, you'll barely have enough strength to push the guard's body into the grave after you. If you talk again, it'll be your body I push into that grave. Kiss my... Just breathe here. Please, Freddie screamed, throwing himself between them. He's only trying to help. We've known each other a long time, Stan. You can trust that I chose Eric for a reason. How many jobs have we done together, huh? We're petty thieves. That's all we've ever been. All we're good at is cracking safes. To put money before human life, it's meaningless. Answer me this. When was the last time we worked together? 10 years? I've changed a lot since then, White said. You didn't change into this, Freddie argued. You're not a murderer. Just listen to my side, okay? White paused to see if either of them would interject. When they both remained silent with their hands at their sides, he continued. All right, we find out who the guard will be that night, approach him before he gets to work, and finish him off. There's no guard on duty when the cemetery is open, so it's his job to close the gate for the night and watch the place until the sun comes up. When the police search for him the next morning, there's nothing that connects his disappearance with the cemetery. Think about it. His time card isn't punched, the gate's still open, there's no one to say they even saw him at work, and there's nothing in his office that hints he was there in the last 24 hours. So the cops decide he didn't even get to work, and they start to search his home and where he was last seen. There would be no need to investigate the cemetery at all. He gave them another bright smile. So you want to haul his body to the graveyard and carry him around all night until we can dump him in the hole? Eric asked, shaking his head. White gave a silent nod. Murder is murder, Eric said. No, it's not, White laughed. This is reasoning. I'm sorry you feel that way, Freddie responded. I'm not. I'm thinking logically here. This way no one has to know. We kill the poor slug and then he gets buried in the same hole we have to dig anyway. And then he gets buried in the same grave we have to fill anyway. It's flawless. Think about it. Listen to you. Kill the poor slug and no one has to know? You haven't killed a wild animal, let alone a human being. What makes you think you can do it? Freddie pressed. White grinned, withdrew his weapon, and pointed its nose into his friend's face. Freddie backed against the soiled wall, palms out, eyes bugging out of their sockets. He tried not to stare into the muzzle of White's gun. Instead, he looked at his own feet, choosing his next words carefully. Before he could say anything, Eric had already opened his mouth. For God's sake, he's your friend, Eric cried. White whirled around to point the gun at Eric, who yelped and ducked to the floor. Huddling against the wall and hiding his face in his hands, he peeked between his fingers to see that White was a black silhouette in the lamplight, a dark giant that waved in and out of the glare with a rocking laugh that shook his entire frame. Stan, please, Freddie yelled. I tell you to bring someone trustworthy into this job, and this is who you choose, White said. Look at him, cowering like a child. You're pointing a gun at him. He's the reason you're backing out, isn't he? He's swayed you, made you soft. So you're gonna kill him? Freddy cried. Is that it? Fred stopped laughing and stared into Freddy's eyes, the gun still focused on Eric's body. His glare pierced Freddy, invaded and accused him. At first, Freddy saw the boy he once knew inside that stare, temporal and quiet. Then the eyes suddenly flashed and Freddy met the new Stanley White. The Stanley White that had given him a phone call only a week ago, after 10 years of disassociation. When he had laid eyes on the new Stanley, he hardly recognized him. His hair was thinning and gray, the cheekbones on his face were all too apparent, and the oversized jacket he wore weighed down his shoulders. 10 years had passed since they last spoke, and here came Stanley White, out of the shadows, with a scheme up his giant sleeve to get rich. What had changed Stanley in all those years? He still had his temper. That was something he could never shake. But he still wasn't the same. This man chilled Freddy. Freddy's eyes darted to the gun and then to the gnarled finger wrapped around the trigger. Stanley pulled back the hammer on the pistol. Eric whined in the corner, but White didn't take his eyes off of Freddy. He waited for his friend to say something, to challenge him, and stand up to him one last time. But he wasn't expecting those 3 simple words to resonate from Freddy's vocal cords. And when they did, something inside him snapped. Who are you? Freddy asked. White's face crumpled and the hand holding the weapon slowly dropped to his side. Without a word, White gathered his lamp and went for the door. Before he reached the exit, he spun back around, but neither Eric nor Freddy could make out his features or determine if he was pointing the pistol at them again. I forgot to load it, White said. He took his time in tucking the gun into his waistband. He switched off the lantern, allowing for the natural sunlight to creep through the cracks in the walls to line the floors like prison stripes. So, you're out. It was more of a statement than a question. Yes, replied Freddy. Eric didn't even look up from his hands inside the fetal position, but Freddy spoke for the group. Well, I'm going through with the job, he said. I need to know that you'll keep quiet. We won't say a word. The figure in the doorway seemed to nod. I guess I'm on my own. There's no time to find a new group by Monday, he said. Only he was more to himself than anyone else. I've waited too long. Can't put it off anymore. I'm sorry, Stan. He still refused to leave. He continued to sway next to the door as if in a drunken daze, awkwardly waiting for someone to challenge him a second time, so he may have a chance to reassert his authority. I'm better than you, he finally said to Freddy. Yeah, I bet. It's got to be nice to have no principle. Are you kidding? It's great. Look at your disgusting pet on the floor. He would love to tear my throat out, I know. I, on the other hand, wouldn't waste a bullet on either one of you. I feel sorry for you. Don't. We're all going to hell. Then the door cracked open and light filled Freddy's senses, causing him to squint heavily and turn away. When he gathered himself and glanced back into the warm daylight, Stanley White was gone. Loose Ends, Part 2. White sat in the driver's seat of his car, his gaunt fingers running back and forth across the lines on his forehead. He was parked across the street from Freddy's apartment building, a baseball hat pulled over his eyes, casting a solid black veil across his face. He had taken off his jacket, revealing a set of bony arms under a sweat-stained t-shirt. A pair of sunglasses was perched on his nose, a cigarette burning between his dry lips. As he stared off at the front of the building, he scratched the scruff of his beard, the fingers on his other hand curling around the sweaty grip of his pistol. While he waited for Freddy to return home, his mind raced. He was going through with the job, all right. He knew that the pieces buried with the dead man were rightly his. He figured that he was doing this for his father, to pay tribute to him in some way. His dad always had a deep jealousy toward his brother for the heirlooms he secretly coveted. White could see the fire of hatred spark in the man's eyes whenever the treasures were mentioned, a look so unmistakable and potent. On the other end of the spectrum was 800 grand, all stacked into a leather briefcase. He would have to duck into hiding for a few years. Maybe he would go to Mexico or Canada. Hell, with that kind of money, anything was possible. White took a drag from his cigarette and flicked the gray ash to the mat under his feet. He knew he couldn't trust either one of them. Freddy wasn't the same person. White didn't understand him like he used to. Who are you? He thought bitterly. I should have asked him the same question. Inhale. Freddy had to be taken care of. Then, of course, Eric would have to be next. He would give him the practice and courage he would need for Monday night. Exhale. It was a shame that he would have to dig the grave by himself. With 3 men shoveling, the job would have been completed in 4 or 5 hours. Now that it was 1 man with a shovel, it would take all night for Stanley to call the project done. Inhale. How he hated those traitors. How he wanted to feel their hot blood stain his hands. There was that bubbling anger again, and White quickly diminished it with one empty squeeze of his left hand. Out came that smile, smoke pouring between the cracks of his teeth. and his cigarette barely holding on to his bottom lip. "I am one cool customer," he remarked with a sharp chuckle. "I am one suave devil." Across the street, Freddy appeared as he rounded a corner, juggling keys and a paper sack in his arms. He never even looked up from his hands. The hard part was now dodging into the building behind Freddy without him noticing. White was out of his car and crossing the street just as Freddy was climbing the first stair of his front stoop. Freddy selected the correct key and jammed it into the door, which he pushed open with his free hand. White was right behind him, just mounting the steps, and discarding his half-finished cigarette to the warm concrete. Freddy was already inside the building and turning the corner as the door was swinging closed. White outstretched one hand and caught it just before it latched to its frame. He slithered inside, fingers instinctively going for the band of his pants. There he found the cool surface of his pistol and he smiled once more. There are only 2 floors to the building, so when Freddy entered the elevator, White knew where he had to go. The elevator doors met and White hurried for the stairs. He made his way to the top landing, pressing his ear to the door, fingers drumming the metallic ball of the knob. On the other side, he heard the elevator ding and the obvious creak of footsteps. He paused for 5 or 6 seconds and slowly pushed open the door. He heard a lock click at the end of the hallway and spotted Freddy's apartment almost at once. He crept halfway down the hall before he stopped, yanking the handgun out of his pants. He took a moment to gather himself, his mind working behind his shades with thoughts like the turning gears in a clock. There he was in the hallway of Freddy's apartment building, contemplating murder. White had a moment of sheer panic that almost sent him fleeing for the stairs. He started to sweat, his heart began to race, and his knees knocked together. The door to Freddy's apartment seemed like 1,000 miles away, stretching on elastic walls. He remained planted where he was, his weapon pressed against his chest. His very heart seemed to beat against it. "No, this is right," White thought, nodding his head. "The first life I take from this earth should be my best friend." Any other man would say if he had to murder someone, his best friend would be last on his list, but Stanley White wasn't like the others. "That's what makes me better." White switched off the safety of his gun and raised his hand to rap on the door. He could see the incident flash in his mind like one slide of a movie, bright and beautiful. It was an image of Freddy, mouth pulled into a scream as White pushed him back inside his apartment, the gun's nose digging into the flesh of his neck. Then the knob turned on its own, sending White's heart into his throat like a rocket. He panicked and darted away from the doorway, all the blood collecting in his head. He found he no longer had any control of his feet, because before he knew it, they carried him back to the stairwell and down all 37 steps. As he burst through the door and out into the lobby, there was still a pistol in his hand, and he feverishly stuffed it into his pants. In the passenger seat of his car, he buried his face in his hands, wondering what had just gone wrong. Did the turning knob mean Freddy was leaving his apartment? Why would he enter his house, stay for a minute, and then leave again? Did he see White flee down the hallway, away from him? "I should have gone through with it," he grunted. "I should have just finished the job right then and there." If Freddy didn't leave the building in the next few minutes, White would know he was still inside his apartment. Then he'd start over again and finish what he had started. No excuses. When he tore his face out of his palms, Freddy was at the front entrance of the building, halfway down the stairs. He carried a large duffel bag with both of his hands, his face pulled back in a painstaking grimace. Veins stood out in his arms and in his forehead as he dropped the bag onto the sidewalk. The bag was unzipped, and Stanley could see light reflect off the blade of a shovel. Freddy took a long second before heaving the strap over his shoulder to continue around the corner. White watched him disappear and found he was clenching his fists again. Stanley White began to dream in red color. Scott Bailey unlocked his office and stepped inside, plucking a keyring off the hook by his desk. Whistling a high-pitched tune, he hiked back outside, up the gravel path, and through the open gate of Hugh and Lowry Memorial Cemetery. He did a quick sweep of the grounds, eyes peeled for any last-minute visitors. But everything looked clear, so he proceeded back toward the exit. The sun was just dropping out of sight. The sky tinted a dark blue, almost the color violet. The night had always been a tranquil time of the day for Scott Bailey, and he could easily stay up until dawn, without circles under his eyes or a swagger to his steps. A job like his lacked an excitement factor, so most nights he would not often shake himself awake just before business hours. If he overslept, there was an alarm he had on his desk, and sometimes it came in handy. Easiest job in the world, but there was limited excitement. A brisk wind folded over him, and he took it into his lungs and let it back out again. He shut the gate, secured the padlock, and returned to his office, whistling a fresh tune. He hung his keys up, punched his time card, stuck it in its slot, and sat down behind his desk. He switched on his 12-inch television set and kicked up his heels. Outside, the violet sky changed to an impenetrable black. 2 dark figures appeared on the gravel path of Hugh and Lowry Memorial Cemetery, pausing before the door to Scott's office. A heavy duffel bag settled on the ground in a series of metallic clinks. The door suddenly swung open and rebounded off the wall. Scott shot up from his seat as 2 men dressed in black sweatsuits and ski masks rushed inside. Scott didn't even have a chance to scream before hands thrust him up against the wall, his head leaving a saucer-sized dent in the dry plaster. His desk was thrown into him, pinning his midriff into the corner. This time when he tried to scream, a gloved hand covered his mouth. He tried to shake off the man, but the other intruder climbed over the desktop and held his shoulders against the wall. Scott went to bite into the hand over his mouth and nose, but his teeth sank into something moist and bitter. He inhaled, and a burning vapor filled his nostrils. At once his vision clouded, and all his muscles loosened into clay. Somewhere far off, the men were pulling away from him, and he was falling against the top of his desk. Their voices were all around him, coming in and out like weak radio signals. Before he disappeared into the dark pit, there was the jingle of keys. Scott was scrambling up a rocky slope, dirt, weeds, and stones coming away with his fingers. He fell once, twice, and then 3 times, sliding and tumbling down a never-ending hill. He would pause for a moment before continuing his climb, blood dripping off him like running water, forever following a trail of red droplets and the tattered remnants of his own clothing. There was an echoing voice bouncing off the hills all around him, and he was quite sure it was speaking to him, even though he couldn't understand anything it had to say. He blinked tears out of his eyes to better see the sky, which was as pitch black as the hole he was trying to climb out of. Footsteps on floorboards closely followed the voice, heavy, hollow, heel, toe, heel, toe. He scanned the rocky slope from left to right, but no one was around. It was only him and the invading darkness. A voice met him again, and this time Scott could make out some of its words. "Well, can see, boys, already? A visit?" A bright light suddenly pierced the night, and a shadow came out of the terrific glare, complete with a head, shoulders, and reaching arms. It towered over Scott, its gigantic hands hovering, as if to squash his face into the dirt. Scott screamed and closed his eyes, scrambling blindly up the hill with bleeding hands and raw knees. I can barely... my thoughts," the voice bellowed. Then fingers closed on his shoulders and his eyes shot open. The overhead light hit him hard, and he had to blink rapidly to discern the man standing before him. He tried to call out, but his lips were held fast with duct tape, and when he attempted to raise his hands to massage his splitting head, he found his wrists were handcuffed in front of him, and ropes bound his arms to his sides. Handcuffs also tagged his ankles, and securely, judging by the tingling sensation that shot up his legs like crystals in the bloodstream. "At least I have some company as I wait," the man said to Scott as he pulled the crooked desk away from the corner. He righted Scott's swivel chair and plopped down into it, throwing his legs over the desktop and crossing them. The man wore a suede jacket some 5 sizes too big for him, and a pair of faded blue jeans. He shook a cigarette out of his jacket pocket and stuck it between 2 peeling lips. With the toe of his tennis shoe, he nudged the power button on Scott's TV. He turned his head on a crane's neck to watch the basketball game already in progress. His empty eyes seemed to look past the television set, past the office, and out into the night. Scott had many questions to ask the man relaxing behind his desk, like who he was and where the other 2 men were. He forgot that he still had tape over his mouth, and the first question came out as a guttural moan. The man looked over at him as he lit his cigarette. He set his lighter right side up on the desk and blew fog over the burning light in the ceiling. "What's your name?" the man asked him. Scott could only stare back at him dumbly, shifting his weight in hopes of waking his dead legs. The man broke out in a grin and withdrew his feet from the desk. He strode over to Scott, tore the piece of duct tape from his lips, and proceeded back to the corner. Scott's first tendency was to scream as loud as he could, but when the man turned back his way, he was holding a handgun, which he set next to the lighter. He leaned up against the desk, eyeing Scott with a drawing interest. "What's your name?" he asked again. Scott kept his mouth shut, tears beginning to well. "I can put the tape back on if you don't want to talk to me," the stranger said, shrugging his shoulders. "I thought I was doing you a favor." "Scott." "Hello, Scott. It's nice to meet you." Scott's eyes darted to the office door, and the man followed his gaze. He smiled and drew from his cigarette. He returned to the chair and kicked his heels back up, causing the lighter to clatter to the floor. "My name's Stanley, and if you treat me with respect, I'll do the same to you." "What do you guys want from me?" "Oh, I'm not with the men that tied you up," Stanley responded. "I'm on my own tonight." "Then why don't you help me? Call the police and let me up. They took my keys. They might still be in the cemetery." "You don't miss a thing, do you, Scott?" "Help me! Why don't you help me?" Scott cried. "I'm not here for that, I'm sorry to say," Stanley answered. "I'm only here to visit for a while. I have to go out there and do some things you probably wouldn't like." "You know the men that did this to me?" Stanley nodded. "I can't trust them. They betrayed me." "Then untie me and we'll get them back. We'll get the police and they'll be put away. Please untie me. We can stop them." Stanley laughed, holding his stomach and shaking his head. "I don't want to stop them just yet, Scott. Have some patience." "What are you talking about?" Stanley's eyes went blank and they flitted to the door. A shadow fell over his face, his smile faltered, and his brow furrowed. Something like a dark creature was emerging from behind his empty stare, clawing up a rocky slope into the light, dwindling in the distance. "I'll let them do all the work. But I won't let them touch what is mine, Stanley said. They won't see me coming. Scott hung his head and let his tears fall. At that moment he knew he was a dead man. He was going to die there in the corner with his hands and ankles cuffed like a prisoner. What is your favorite thing to do? When Scott looked up, Stanley was smiling his smile and smoking a cigarette. What? Scott answered with a heavy sigh. If this was your last night on Earth, what would you do? Scott's chest started to seize with pressing sobs that stole his breath and closed his throat. Tears spotted his collar and spittle stained his chin. Well, answer me or the tape goes back on, he threatened. Hug my wife. Stanley looked away from Scott and appeared to pay attention to the TV. I can't help you there. How about something else? I'd like to see her again, Scott said. Will you just answer me? Respect me and I'll respect you. Do you remember that? Scott nodded and Stanley eased back into his chair. Maybe a cigarette, Scott said. Stanley nodded and retrieved his pack. He got up to stick the cigarette in Scott's mouth, and he lit it with the lighter from the floor. Scott inhaled deeply and was relieved to find that his headache was quickly diminishing, replaced by that sweet ebb of comfort. Stanley dropped the pack into Scott's lap and then set the lighter between his feet, right side up, of course. Smoke as many as you like, Scott, because this is your night, Stanley said. I'm sure you're a good man, and I have nothing against you. This is business. Only business. You just happened in the wrong place is all. Inhale. Scott couldn't reply, not unless he wanted the cigarette to tumble into his lap and burn through the crotch of his pants. All he could do was watch the man with wide swimming eyes and puff on that cigarette. It was all he had left. It was all he had to organize his reeling thoughts. Exhale. Stanley wandered back to the desk and briefly checked his watch, discarding his own cigarette to the floor. What would you like to watch, Scott? This is your office. Scott didn't reply. Stanley gave him a brief look and nodded his head. Basketball it is. Scott would have never guessed this man hadn't killed before. He remembered the blank look that had come over him and the haunting words he'd said. I'll let them do all the work, but I won't let them touch what is mine. They won't see me coming. That fucker is clinically insane, Eric said, pressing the shovel into the soil with his boot. He brings a gun to our meeting and pulls it on us, and you're his best friend? Will you stop bringing that up? I haven't talked to Stan in over 10 years. I'm not sure he can still be considered a friend, Freddie replied. They both dug in at the same time, sweat budding on each of their foreheads and staining their masks. Eric suddenly dropped his shovel to loosen the fingers of his locked claws. Freddie watched him with mild interest and went back to work, his collections of dirt arcing delicately into the air. Goddamn my fucking fingers, man. They're cramping on me, Eric cried, plopping down in the grass. Come on, if we want to be out of here by midnight, we have to pick up the pace, Freddie said, from behind his wool mask. His teeth gleamed in the darkness like sparkling pearls. Eric shook out his flashlight and pointed the beam at their project. Freddie stood inside the grave as he worked, and from where Eric sat, he couldn't see his partner's shins. He calculated that they were almost 2 feet into the earth, which left 4 more feet if it was true that everyone was buried 6 feet under. They'd been digging for a little over an hour, which was pretty good time. He considered it was the loose dirt that was making the job that much easier. But there was still work to be done, and Eric's hands resembled those of an arthritic senior citizen, right down to the gnarled, trembling fingers. Eric tore off his mask and used it to mop his forehead, lightly running his fingers through his hair. Put that light out if you don't want to draw attention, Freddie hissed, heaving another load of earth into the wind. Pick up your shovel. Eric killed the light. Do you believe the crap under your feet is really worth as much as White said? Eric asked. He still made no attempt to get up or retrieve his shovel. I don't know, but I'm sure it's worth a lot, Freddie replied. He pulled his sweatshirt away from his chest to circulate air. It was 9 o'clock at night, 36 degrees, and both men were sweating like pigs. Take off your mask, Eric advised. We've already taken care of the hard part. Freddie nodded and tossed his ski mask onto their pile of discarded dirt. You know for sure this Dylan guy is reliable? Eric asked. Freddie nodded, digging in again. He's always been a collector of antiques. We go back a while, so I know he won't cross us. But will he try to bullshit us? Nah, he's cool. But it will be an inconvenience to go to Maryland to find him. That is, if he's still living there. Hopefully the heat will be off by the time we meet him. If the story of the missing family jewels is still printed on the front page of every paper, we shouldn't let anyone near the pieces. It's common sense that we should lay low for a while. Eric joined Freddie inside the hole, toting his shovel like a rifle. They dug in silence for another half an hour before they took a short breather, leaning on their shovels for support and panting hoarsely. Can you imagine what White will do when he digs all this up on Monday and finds everything is already gone? Eric huffed, shaking his head. You know he's going to come after us, Freddie answered. But he won't find us. We won't stop moving. White is smarter than you think. He knows how to follow the right signs. I think his anger fuels him or motivates him somehow. He can be blowing fire yet still keep his mind open. He's the opposite of blind rage. Anger opens his eyes and points him in a certain direction. Yeah, I know, I already heard this speech. Freddy ignored him. I've seen him blow up to the point where he's kicking a fallen man in the ribs, laughing like a fucking psycho. But he always knew when to quit before he went too far, Freddy explained. I don't think he knows how to do that anymore. He's changed for the worst. He won't find us, Eric concluded. Stan never trusted anyone. I was the only person he could really confide in. But as the years went on, he became more distant. After that, we just sort of went our separate ways. Listen, the guy's a nutjob. Case closed, Eric said. Keep your ass on your shovel, man. Freddy still couldn't let the topic drop. You heard him in the warehouse. He didn't know if he could trust us. He was afraid we'd spill everything to the cops. So, that's understandable. Plus, we swore to him we wouldn't. It seemed to put him at ease. Freddy shook his head, grasping Eric's shoulder and pulling him close. That's where I disagree with you. I don't think he was convinced at all. If I know Stan, he would make sure anything of concern, all the loose ends were taken care of before he followed through with something. Freddy's eyes bulged with realization. Any doubt in his mind would have to be taken care of. I get it, Eric snapped, shrugging Freddy's hand off his shoulder. What are you saying? He would have to kill us before he started digging? Yeah, I guess I am. Well, we're alive now. Maybe he was going to kill us, but after we get the loot, we're leaving town and our old lives. We're beating him to the punch. Stan is smarter than that. You said it yourself, the man has never killed before. So how do we know he even has the capacity? Eric countered with a laugh. Years ago in college I might have even agreed, but I would have never thought he was capable of killing me. There was a long pause. And? Eric insisted. Tonight I'm sure he is. I also have a feeling we'll be meeting him again before we reach Maryland. Freddy glanced down at the headstone, marking the grave of a man who was only a stranger to him, a man he had never met or even seen a picture of. Michael J. White, 1932 to 2008. I think we need to take a page out of Stan's book. For our own defense, he turned back to his partner. We need to buy a gun. In the darkness of the cemetery, a dull glow suddenly appeared in the distance, first as only a small orb, and then as a bright halo. Eric and Freddy couldn't see the light bobbing near the front gate, closing the distance between them, for they were 6 feet under, just cracking their blades against Michael J. White's coffin. There was a whoop of glee that rose out of the ground, followed closely by the splintered crack of wood. The light extinguished into nothing. There was something coming, and now it was quickening its pace. The Loose Ends, Part 3. Scott Bailey stared at the lighter between his feet for the longest time. He watched it for so long that his vision began to blur and double. He drew off his cigarette, but found that it had burned to the filter and gone out. He spat it across the room. The man had left around 15 minutes ago, toting a camping lantern like a boy would his lunchbox. The gun went into the band of his pants, which he patted twice as if to make sure it was really there. He switched off the TV and pushed the chair into the desk. Scott had a feeling that he was finding things to do, as if he were putting something off. He was overthinking. The way he paced around the office, zipping and unzipping his coat, spoke louder than words ever could. Then he turned to look at Scott. He gave him a small smile and a quick salute. Smoke those cigarettes, he said. I won't put the tape back on your mouth because I'll be right back. I know you'll behave yourself. The man named Stanley was then out the door and into the night. Scott's eyes darted to the lighter, attempting to wrap his mind around his current situation. Could it really be that easy? Could that man not have seen what he'd set up for him? Scott half expected Stanley to barge back into his office, laughing to the point where tears trickled down his face. How could I be so stupid? He'd say as he pocketed the lighter. But the door did not open again, and it was only Scott and the upright lighter, perfectly placed in front of him. He had to stare at it for a few minutes to make sure that it was really there, actually taking up space within his reach. He swiped the pack of cigarettes off his lap and tucked in his legs so that the chain of his handcuffs caught the lighter and reeled it in. It only took 2 of his fingers to snatch it off the floor, and in no time he had it up to the coil of rope binding his wrists to his sides. Smoke began to fill the room as the rope curled and broke. His hands were free, but not his arms. He flicked the wheel of his lighter and held the flame up to the cord securing his chest. His eyes watered and burned from the smoke, the nauseating stench clawing at the inside of his nostrils. Could it really be that easy? He asked himself, trying to hold back a grin. When the ropes fell off his body, he abandoned the lighter and drew his legs back to his chest. When he tried to stand up, he slid sideways down the wall. He tried again and fell over on his back. Nothing is that easy. The jewel box was tucked under Michael White's left hand. Eric carefully lifted the piece of meat and extracted the box. He got to his feet, tearing open the lid and shuffling greedily through the contents inside. The one item he examined was the antique pocket watch, protected in a small plastic bag. He handed it to Freddy, who ran it over in his hands, smiling to himself. Put it back for now. Freddy replied, handing the watch back to Eric. We'll look over that later, when we're in a safer place. Eric nodded, closing the box tight and tucking it under his arm. They both exchanged a short smile and patted each other on the back. Freddy glanced down at White's deceased uncle. His dirt-caked fingers happened on the dead man's hand, and he quickly withdrew them. The skin was so icy to the touch, so leathery like the hide stretched across a horse. The appearance wasn't the worst of it, Freddy decided. It had to be the smell. Freddy breathed through his mouth to prevent the repelling odor from turning his stomach and weighing down his head. He knew it was affecting his partner as well. At least Eric had stopped gagging, but the color on his face was still green. Freddy knew he had to get Eric out of the grave if he wanted Michael White's suit to remain pristine and spotless. It was Freddy's every intention to respect the dead. Go up and get the hammer and nails, Freddy told Eric. He tilted his head toward the opening to get a lungful of fresh air. Sure, Eric replied with relief. He went to stand between Michael's legs when Freddy grabbed his wrist. He nodded at the jewel box still under Eric's hand. Hey, you got it, he said, placing the box on the dead man's chest. Using his shovel as a makeshift ladder, Eric heaved his upper body out of the hole and pulled himself onto the wet grass. There he lay on his back, staring up at the silver sliver of a moon, gulping continuously at the sweet oxygen. As he relaxed in the lunar glow, he stretched with exhausted relief, humming lightly. He wasn't looking forward to filling the grave, but the hardest part was done. They had it. They finally had their buried treasure. His mouth and throat broke open with gales of laughter. The moon was suddenly blotted out, bathing Eric in shadow. He immediately stopped laughing. What appeared in the moon's place were two wide eyes. Oh! Eric was kicked across the side of the head and he went rolling away from the grave, crying out, his hands pressed against his temples. Another blow lit up his face and Eric had to hold his cheek to stop the flow of blood, freely seeping through the cracks in his fingers. He was struck again in the back of the neck and he screamed. From inside the grave, Freddy froze. Eric howled, nursing his neck and face. His legs thrashing in the grass, kicking up mud. A fourth kick to the skull finally silenced him. Eric? Freddy asked from inside the hole. He lifted himself onto the lip of the coffin, digging his fingertips into the soft wall for support. Eric, what the fuck happened? He heard a click and the night was silent again. Eric, come on, man, answer me. His voice was cracking now and the sweat on his face was running. He heard heavy footfalls at the edge of the grave and a head appeared, followed by shoulders, a chest, and a pair of legs. Even in the darkness, Freddy could see that it was Stanley White, tall in stature and unnaturally thin. The figure watched him silently, and Freddy could bet his life that he was holding a gun. Freddy bent down into the coffin and retrieved his flashlight. Slowly, he raised the torch into the opening and switched it on. Light flooded White's smiling face, his eyes alive and bright like two reflective mirrors. Don't worry, Eric isn't dead, White reassured Freddy. Stan, shit, don't even open your mouth unless it's to pray to your god, White said. Let's not let the last thing you say on this earth be bullshit. Stan, please, I can... Don't bullshit me, Freddy. White raised his pistol into the line of the flashlight, which was quickly extinguished as it fell from Freddy's hands. It landed on the corpse next to the valued jewelry box. Again, White was only a shadow. Don't do this, Stan, please. Pray. Freddy shook his head, tears rolling down his dirt-caked cheeks. From where he stood, the walls of the grave seemed to stretch on for eternity. Pray, Freddy. Pray for forgiveness. Let's see if your God will forgive you for taking what isn't yours. It isn't yours either, Freddy screamed. You're no better than us. White frowned and positioned himself before the moon in such a way that a silvery halo encircled his head. Here was the Angel of Death, the Reaper of Life, the bringer of both light and darkness. No, Freddy. Who's in the grave and who's up here? He fired into the hole and struck Freddy in the chest. Freddy was thrown into Michael White, scattering the box and flashlight to either end of the coffin. He screamed, clawing at the walls of the grave, dirt raining down on him, filling his mouth. Blood gushed from the open wound, a red ring spreading over his sweatshirt like an oversized target. I wanted to kill you first, White yelled over Freddy's scream. I've decided that my first should mean something. Let me explain before you go shaking your head. It's like killing my first deer. I don't want to start with the small doe at her mother's side. No, I want the bull, with the glorious rack I can hang on my wall as a trophy. You can sympathize with that, can't you? Eric is nobody. He means nothing to me. You, on the other hand, are something special. I could have even killed the guard, but no. I left the best for first. White chuckled and glanced over his shoulder to make sure Eric was still out. Did you hear any of that? Tell me, do you agree with what I just said? Freddy only gurgled blood, kicking his legs wildly. White nodded. I think I've made my point. This time he shot into Freddy's skull. When he turned around to take care of Eric, two hands pushed him hard against the chest. Eric was crouched at White's feet, face full of blood, teeth bared in a deadly snarl. White teetered backward, one arm whirling in a tight circle, while the arm joined with the gun swung south. Before he plummeted into the grave with his uncle and best friend, he blew a hole in Eric's swollen face. He landed on both sets of legs. His lower body smashed the lid of the coffin, snapping it into two separate pieces. His head cracked the jewel box, the pieces spilling out over Freddy's open chest. He lay still for some time, his vision a swirling blur of darkness. The moon spun in the sky, leaving milky white trails of light. When he was finally able to move his arms and wiggle the toes inside his sneakers, Scott Bailey was just opening the door to his office. Scott hobbled outside into the night, the cuffs taking a fresh bite out of his ankles with each tentative hop. He glanced to his left and then to his right, and the only detail he could discern in the dark was the faint glint of light from his keys, still protruding from the open gate. He turned his back to the cemetery and joined the gravel path, to begin his slow progress down the hill. He could see the parking lot at the bottom, where his car and one other vehicle were parked. The street adjoining the lot was desolate. A pale glow washed over its center from a lone streetlight. All these articles were like toys from his place at the top of the hill, which might as well have been a mountain for Scott, given the chains fastening all four of his limbs. He feared there wasn't a lot of time left, judging by the gunshots in the graveyard. There was more than one, possibly 4 shots total. Scott knew that the 2 men were now dead. He was sure that the men in ski masks didn't have weapons of their own, or they would have showed them off inside the office. Maybe they used Stanley's gun against him, but that seemed even more far-fetched. They were gone, and soon Stanley would have to come back for him. Why did he leave me alive? I know he planned to kill me, so why didn't he shoot me when he had the chance? He thought to himself. Near the bottom of the hill, he tottered forward and struck the gravel path, hands outstretched. His wrists buckled and he slid the rest of the way down on his stomach, the handcuff shredding the skin on his arm and snapping the other. His shirt tore open, gravel and dirt collecting into fresh gashes on his chest, and the left side of his face was reduced to a bloody mess. When he skidded to a stop at the underside of the rise, he was lost in a cloud of dust. He rolled off his wounded arms and stomach, sobbing loudly. Then he dared to look at his broken wrist, and his stomach turned when he saw that his hand was barely hanging on by a string of flesh. He's going to come back, he thought. He has to come back for me. That's when he bit his lip and rolled over onto his stomach. He began to crawl. White was sitting up now, holding his head, while he reholstered his weapon. The jewelry box was completely totaled. None of the pieces were inside of the box, thank God. They were scattered across Freddy's chest, each item in their own individual baggie. He collected the items in his hands and inspected them under the moonlight. They were all there. The pieces he had only seen a few times before, set behind a glass case at his grandfather's house, were now in his hands, in his possession. He couldn't help but smile. He quickly and carefully slipped the items into his inside jacket pocket. Gripping the lips of the coffin, he pulled himself away from the bodies. Before attempting to stand, he rested his back against the grave wall, massaging his legs, while testing and prodding all the sore spots. It didn't look like he broke anything, but his shoulder cried out each time he tried to lift his arm. His fingers scoped out the source of pain on his scalp, and they cupped the egg-sized lump residing there, from impact with the cedar box. He wasn't particularly worried about that. He was concerned for the antiques. In the pale light, they all looked in order, but what about once he was home under a lamp? The next issue at hand was getting out of the grave. With a deep breath, he got back on his feet, and he was surprised to see that he could easily balance his weight. With one last look at Freddy, draped over the corpse of his uncle, White used the upright shovel to lever himself. He could only operate his right arm, due to his throbbing left shoulder, but it was really all he needed. His fingers dug into the soil above his head as he planted his left foot on the handle of the shovel. He tried all his weight on it before heaving himself out of the coffin with one push of his leg. He was able to peek out of the hole, desperately clawing at the soft grass with his one good hand. He punched the toe of his free shoe into the wall a few inches above the handle, and shoved off with that leg, dragging the rest of his upper body into the night. Eric lay just to his right, face down, his knees tucked under him and hands sprawled out before the edge of the grave as if he were in the middle of a Muslim prayer. A pool of his blood was still seeping out over the grass. White limped around the body, planting one of his heels on Eric's tailbone, and pushed. Eric slid forward, his arms dangling over the lip of the hole before his entire body tumbled over. There was a tremendous crash and dust rose into the air. White peered into the grave. He couldn't see his uncle at all under the collection of fresh bodies. All he could make out were a pair of dusty black dress shoes pointing up at him. He gathered his lamp, switched it on, and placed it beside the open duffel bag. Rummaging inside, he found a box of nails, a crowbar, and a couple of hammers. Obviously, they meant to seal the coffin again, but White couldn't see himself taking the extra time. The lid was pulverized anyway. He threw the bag into the hole and stripped off his jacket. Without a moment's hesitation, he strode over to the shovel and tossed in his first scoop of earth. When he went back for his second, his head raised, the shovel rolled out of his hands, and his eyes widened. He took his lantern and hurried for the front gate, his fingers going for his pistol. His able arm held up the lantern, which bobbed with each hurried step. He didn't tear the gun out just yet. He only placed his fingers on its grip, taking comfort in the warm burn from its last shot. He broke out of the cemetery and stopped. The door to the office was lightly swinging in the wind. Light flooded out of the doorway, shining a spotlight along the gravel path. White stopped for a moment to poke his head inside, and the first thing that struck him was the smothering perfume of smoke. In the corner was a simple coil of rope. His temperature rose and his teeth gnashed. Fire, much like the flame from a lighter, was igniting in his eyes. This time, when he clenched his fist, it was around his gun. White took off down the gravel path, heart pounding and his breath raspy and harsh. Sudden relief washed over him. The night watchman was at the bottom of the hill, just crawling into the parking lot. He must have heard Stanley's approach because he turned his head. Scott began to scramble over the asphalt, screaming at the top of his voice. White took off down the hill, but his feet tangled together and he went over. He fell on his lantern, which shattered under his weight. He slid down the gravel path, his gun skidding away from him into the high grass. At the bottom, he rolled to a stop, one side of his shirt torn to shreds and his arms out at his sides. White stirred briefly, muttering inaudible words under his breath. He was able to levitate his head, and through the dim screen of darkness, he could see the white of the guard's socks vanish behind Freddy's car. With a grunt, he rolled over onto his stomach, then onto his back. He continued this until he touched pavement, and he got on his hands and knees, attempting to stand. Scott Bailey slid behind a parked car, his hand over his mouth to stifle his heavy breathing. He heard a heavy grunt, and there was the shuffle of feet. At first the steps were dragging and inattentive, but they soon evened out. Scott spotted his car, which floated in his blurred vision like a mirage. He felt the bulge of his keys in his hip pocket, and he suddenly couldn't wait any longer. He had no way of defending himself, so he wasn't going to lurk in the shadows, hoping to God he would remain unseen. No, he wasn't going to linger so that he may die. He was going to do the only thing he could process in that short, heated moment. He was going to run. Scott bolted to his feet, using the car as leverage. He hopped forward, sneaking a look over his shoulder. The man was limping toward him, his teeth bared. And now that he had spotted Scott, his mouth morphed into a smile. Stanley whooped like a dog, pointing a blood-stained finger at Scott's back, as if aiming a fake gun. Scott's car was maybe 10 yards away, and his hands were reaching for it, fingers extending to their maximum length. Scott began to weep, screaming for help through a mouthful of his spit and tears. He spread his legs too far, and the chain pulled tight. And the chain pulled taut, causing him to stumble and almost fall. The man's heavy breathing was dramatically closer, the vibration from his footfalls rippling through the concrete. Scott was only a few steps away from his car when White threw him into it. His head bounced off the trunk, leaving an ugly dent and knocking him out. White gave a tremendous battle cry as he picked the guard up by the scruff of his neck and threw him back into the cold steel, which crumpled like tin. White let the man hit the concrete as he gathered himself, leaning against the trunk. He bent down to check Scott's pulse and saw that he was still breathing. It was a shame that he would have to be buried alive. White took the man's legs and dragged him across the blacktop, groaning with every inch. Through all the pain and sickness that was weighing him down, he wasn't surprised that laughter filled his burning chest, or that he was smiling. That smile was faint and tired, but it was in happiness all the same. He still had a long night ahead of him, but that didn't mean he had to be miserable. Stanley White began to whistle. That night in Stanley's dream, there was the screech of metal grinding with metal, and he was screaming. He couldn't see anything in all the smoke, and there was a red light tinting his vision. The smoke cleared, and there was blood drenching his hands and jacket. He looked down to see his legs were gone. Out of the red light came a deer, eyes glowing with intense light. White took his hand and placed it on the animal's snout, running his fingers up and down its smooth skin. The deer went to turn away, but White grabbed its antlers and pulled it back. The creature stared at him a little while longer, keeping completely still. The deer's front and back legs were handcuffed. He screamed and reeled away from the animal, glancing into the headlights that were its eyes. Protruding from the deer's thin black lips was a burning cigarette. "I'd like to see her again." Everything went black, and White held up his lantern. He tried to switch it on, but he remained trapped in darkness. Then he woke up. 4 days later. Stanley White stepped out of his car, a ball cap pulled over his head, and a pair of sunglasses pushed up on his nose. He was just tucking his cell phone into his pocket, the conversation from his last call still fresh in his mind. Miles Clapton was in his antique shop, waiting for him. He was excited to finally see the heirlooms. When White asked if he was ready to make an offer, Miles said that he'd been ready for 15 years. White placed a hand to his chest, where the pieces were tucked inside the inside pocket of his coat. They were all perfectly fine, even after the box had been smashed. On his walk, White had a chance to replay the last few days in his mind. After filling the grave, the sun had just made its appearance, and he hurried to a motel off the interstate, where he slept until 9 p.m. When he finally did wake up, he inspected all his wounds and was relieved to see there were no broken bones. Nevertheless, every joint in his body screamed. The lantern had left a black cylindrical bruise across his chest, but every rib seemed intact. With that out of his mind, he turned on the TV. The evening news already had the story. Scott Bailey, age 27, had gone missing. His car was parked at the cemetery, along with another vehicle, with tags for a Fred Walton. There was blood and significant damage to the car. There were also obvious signs of a scuffle in and outside of the watchman's office, and a pistol was found in the grass. When White heard this, he cursed under his breath. He'd searched for that fucking gun for over an hour before giving up. It was only a matter of time before they had his prints. The next day, in another motel room near Longshore, he turned on the TV and saw that the grave of Michael J. White had been dug up, and the bodies of Scott, Bailey, Fred, Wall, and Eric Lewis were found. It wasn't mentioned until the next night that the expensive items were missing. White stopped watching the news in fear that his face would be blown up on the screen. He entered Clapton's antique shop, but there was no one at the front desk. He noticed a door in the back and pushed it open. "Miles, you in here?" A set of strong hands grabbed each of his shoulders. Miles Clapton sat at a desk across the far wall, watching White with a fallen face and sad eyes. Two policemen shoved White against the desktop, overturning Clapton's mug full of pencils. Cuffs were slapped across his wrists, and he was being dragged backward by his arms and collar. "I'm so sorry, Stan," Miles said. White only stared at him. Outside the shop, he was thrust against the cop car, where he was patted down. The cops scattered the items across the trunk. White scanned the pieces for the pocket watch, and he found it. His warped reflection stared back at him from the finely polished silver. Then he was torn away from the glinting specimen, and the same hand shoved him into the back seat of the cop car. He watched the police congregate outside like a pack of wolves. He tried to grasp his situation, but it was all happening so fast he couldn't keep up. One of the cops pushed into the driver's seat and they were off. White remained silent and emotionless in the back seat, as still as a statue. Every once in a while the cop's eyes peeked into the rearview mirror, watching his passenger with interest. "You know what I don't understand?" the policeman asked, glancing back at him. White looked up into the cop's reflected eyes and gave him a warm smile. "What's that?" "Murdered 3 people, dug up a grave, and stole a fortune's worth of possessions," he said. "So how can you sit there smiling and acting calm? You know you'll get life for this, don't you?" White said nothing, only smiled and continued to stare into the black holes of the policeman's eyes. "If I were in your shoes, I'd be trembling like a leaf." "Well, that's what makes me better than you," White replied. He turned away to look out the window with a hint of a smirk on his face, though his eyes were vacant and far off. The wheels inside Stanley White's head were ferociously turning.